shoot. She's got a baby. Oh, shit! Hunter!
We are talking the Vietnam action movie Platoon Leader, which was originally known as the movie simply called Nam, although it was changed to Platoon Leader after the success of the movie Platoon. This one is directed by Aaran Norris, brother of Chuck Norris, although no surprise cameos from Chuck Norris in this movie. Instead, you have Michael Dudikoff, who plays Lieutenant Jeff Knight. You also have an appearance by William Smith, and you've got Robert F. Lyons as well, who is, for me, the standout character as Sergeant McNamara. Now, the movie focuses on Michael Dudikoff's character, Lieutenant Knight, who is a officer, a lieutenant, straight out of West Point, and headed to this platoon where they are defending this village, which is the only non-VC village in the area, and the Vietcong and the NVA are furious apparently because it's a bit of an embarrassment whilst all the surrounding other villages are all under the VC control, North Vietnamese control. This one remains loyal to the South Vietnamese and the Americans, and the VC don't want that. So Lieutenant Knight and his small group of platoon, I think it's 18 men they mention at one point, have varying degrees of engagement with the Vietnamese, the NVA. And as the movie progresses, Lieutenant Knight is injured. His men haven't respected him at that point. He's just an officer straight out of West Point, as I've said. But as the movie progresses, he kind of learns more from his sergeants, from his men, and becomes a more confident and battle-weary leader, leading to greater and more violent battles. So, what do we think of Platoon Leader? Now, I watched this film back in the day, and I was a big fan of Vietnam movies in the 80s. There was a load that came out, and I didn't really like this one when I first watched it all those years ago, and I've just rewatched it for this review. So let's talk about what I think works. Now, I feel this movie definitely feels like an 80s film. So if you're liking the 80s style action movies, then you're going to want to watch this one, perhaps. Now, if you compare this to its contemporaries, and I'm talking probably the well-known Vietnam movies like Platoon or Full Metal Jacket, I feel those two movies in particular have almost like a timeless quality to them. You couldn't really tell that they were made in the 80s because they feel timeless. Obviously, they're set in the correct time period of when the Vietnam War took place, but they didn't have that 80s feel necessarily. This one does. The kind of the sound effects and stuff like that. So if you're a fan of the nostalgia, then you may get a bit of a nostalgia kick out of that. But we're going to kind of come back to that point again. What else that works? I'm going to say, Michael Dudikoff, obviously one-time American ninja, isn't known as the greatest actor, but I don't think he's too bad in here. And I've got to say, the rest of the cast, I think, for the most part, are pretty good here. As I've mentioned, the standout for me was Robert F. Lyons, who really, for me, stole the show as this kind of battle-weary sergeant who initially has a kind of a dislike for Lieutenant Knight, but like a begrudging respect is kind of building. And just his kind of like his attitude and the way the actor kind of carries the performance, I think it's really strong. And there are some strong performances from other characters as well. The other Sergeant Roach, I thought was also, doesn't have as much screen time, but I thought he was quite a memorable character as well. Initially, I thought that the movie was a little not as bloody as I kind of would have thought. There are a couple of scenes where we do see some more grievous wounds, but it's certainly not the most gruesome the Vietnam movies. I've got to say that the movie is quite well shot. There are some really kind of nice kind of scenes here. There's one instance in particular where they are trying to put a character on a chopper and this kind of like waist high water. It's a really well shot sequence basically, which really outstandingly beautiful. Kind of obviously with the kind of the set and the kind of the location shooting. Really striking imagery, I've got to say. The movie is also action-packed. There's loads going on. As I said, the movie progressively gets to bigger and bigger conflicts in the film, and yeah, so you'll never be hanging around too long before you're kind of watching a firefight. And you know, I think everything here in regards to the kind of the kind of the vehicles and stuff like that have all authentic stuff like that. I thought that was pretty good. What doesn't work for me, there's a few things that bother me about this movie a little bit. Like I've said, it definitely has that 80s feel to it, and although that's kind of quite fun for an action movie vibe, it doesn't have that kind of that realism as much as some of the other movies that I've mentioned here. So although I feel this works very much as an action film, it's not really quite as realistic in regards to things like, you know, a realistic war movie. Just a small things here and there. For example, some of the sound effects. They've kind of used bullets bouncing off stone there's no stone there. They're in a field and stuff like this. And I read on there there's no scenes where you see the American soldiers changing magazines and stuff like that. They're always kind of just shooting, never kind of like reloading and things like this. The editing as well. There's a few scenes here that seem to be fairly poorly edited. There's a scene, for example, where a soldier says he's going off to the toilet and he's actually overdosing on heroin. But the way it's shot, that it looks like he's just gone. Like within seconds, there's another guy goes and gets him, and he finds it. He's shot up. Whilst in reality, that sequence that would have probably taken 5 to 10 minutes because they go looking for him. But the way it's edited, it makes it look like this guy goes looking for him almost immediately. So there's some poor editing choices and things like this. Again, I've mentioned this movie is relatively bloodless. Some of the effects look a little bit like effects in regards to petrol explosions and stuff like that. Some inaccuracies, things like tactics. You have American soldiers running out in the middle of a field of fire without cover. Again, it just goes into those action movie cliches. And doesn't really follow what realistically would happen in these kind of situations and stuff like that. But this, like I said, maybe it's a product of its time, and I feel this is why this one really doesn't have the same the following and the same reverence that the movies like Platoon, Full Metal Jacket have and enjoy, because that really does. I mean, they're a bigger budget, more prestige films, I suppose. There is that as well. But I feel that this definitely falls under more of an action movie rather than a harrowing portrayal of war. Although there are subtle elements here that I feel do work. The fact that ultimately what happened to the fate of this village, I feel was very bittersweet. And there's a couple of sequences, for example, where we see some of the fate of the villagers. And how the American soldiers react to them, which I thought was quite good. Overall, I don't think it's a bad film, but I feel it's not particularly memorable. There's not a particularly grand story here. I'm a big fan of the TV show Tour of Duty, and it's a slightly more bloodier version of that, if you ask me. Of a an average episode of Tour of Duty, albeit with a bit more swearing and a little bit more blood in it, but doesn't go to any of the extremes. It's better than I remember, I will say that. I remember I didn't like this movie initially. I feel I enjoyed watching it this second time, and I feel it's worth a watch if you like Vietnam movies. But it certainly doesn't it isn't a classic. You don't have particularly well drawn out characters. It's not a realistic portrayal like some of the other films are to a certain degree. And we seem to be having a there's a bit of a comeback with Vietnam films. Maybe we've had The Last Full Measure and the Australian one, whose name of I can't remember the name now, but that run I reviewed recently a couple of months ago. So maybe maybe it's the Vietnam movies are having a bit of a comeback. Who knows? But yeah, it's okay. It's pretty good for an action film. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Good, but kind of forgettable. Okay, action war movie, but not a classic by any means. Have you seen it? What are your thoughts on Platoon Leader? I'll be interested to know. And what do you think of Michael Dudikoff in this role? Arguably, I've heard people say this is his best performance. He didn't really say a hell of a lot in this movie, to be fair, so maybe that's why. But I didn't think he was bad. I thought he was perfectly fine here. 6 out of 10. Leave me a comment. I'll look forward to seeing you next time, and bye for now.